on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
When you look at the big swath of human history and then also the cultures that exist today around the world, you see that there's no one human diet.
Everybody's playing with a suite of like 30 foods here, and they're just reorganizing them into all these different so-called diets compared to, let's say, the Hadza eating 800 species a year. Like, you're all just playing with the same deck of cards here.
Humans across the world through time seem to have made alcohol when they could. Apes and other primates will eat fermented fruits when they have the opportunity to.
The Mesopotamian domestication events center around a grass. The Chinese center around a grass. The Mexican centers around a grass. It's so funny today to see the grain-free diets. Hey, these are really important foods to people.
Culture is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Then food is a really rich area that we use to kind of think about who we are. You are what you eat.
Episode 130 of the WildFed podcast, Diet Defines Us, Food, Culture, and Our Past with Robyn Cutright, PhD, is brought to you by Surthrival. You've got to try the new naturally flavored colostrum from Surthrival. Chocolate with real cacao, vanilla with real vanilla extract, strawberry with real strawberry juice. I've been using colostrum daily and promoting it as a powerful nutritional supplement for over 15 years. In fact, I just had a quarter cup in my blended drink this morning and again this afternoon. With its ability to fortify your immune system, nourish and rebuild your gut lining, repair injuries, aid in muscle growth and recovery, and so much more, I think it's one of the most sophisticated food-based supplements we can include in our diet. Surthrival's already known as the #1 source for premium colostrum, and now they've just released 3 new formulas: chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. They're lightly sweetened with monk fruit and combined with MCT oil to make them more soluble in water and in blended drinks, all while having the same potency as Surthrival's original colostrum. They're so good, I keep eating them by the spoonful right out of the tub. Eaten like that, they're like a powdered ice cream. But of course, they make excellent blended drinks too. Again, these aren't those over-the-top fake flavors you taste in so many supplements today. These are flavored with real cacao, vanilla, and strawberry, so they taste great and really clean too. Go to surthrival.com to see the entire lineup of health-promoting supplements and superfoods and use the coupon code WildFed for 5% off your order. Surthrival. Why just survive when you could thrive? Are you looking to source foraged wild food ingredients or products for your restaurant, store, product line, or just your own personal use? Or maybe you're a small business owner in the wild food space or a hobbyist forager looking for a side hustle. Then listen up. This episode's brought to you by foraged.market, a website for both buyers and sellers of wild and specialty foods from around the globe. Think Etsy, but for foods with a story. If you're buying, you'll find plenty of sellers vetted to ensure that they use sustainable practices, carrying those rare, hard-to-find ingredients like ramps, fiddleheads, chaga, truffles, hickory nuts, huckleberries, wild rice, and more. I've personally been using the site to source ingredients for my own company. And remember, if you have products to sell, you can get your own product page to promote your goods, exposing them to a constant stream of ideal buyers. Go over to forage.market/wildfed to get started. There you'll find a coupon code for $10 off your first order. Foraged.market. Buy there, sell there, and learn more about their incredible vision and conservation ethic by listening to episode 122 of the WildFed podcast. Foraged.market, the global marketplace for wild and specialty foods. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. I finally get to share this episode with you today. I've been eagerly awaiting the opportunity to interview Robyn Cutright, PhD, author of The Story of Food in the Human Past. If you listen to the show regularly, you've probably been hearing me reference this book a lot lately, and you know I like to geek out on big human history, in particular that stretch of time before the advent of agriculture, but especially before industrialized food systems. I'm fascinated by what we eat, and more specifically, who we eat, since our foods start their journey towards our mouths as living creatures. Throughout time, our dietary diversity has diminished precipitously to levels that are almost hard to conceive. And in that diminishment, global dietary homogeneity has been reducing our food culture towards a bland uniformity. Not everywhere, of course, but the trend is obvious and becoming global. Not so in the past, when food choices were vast, food cultures developed independently from one another, and people groups and their dietary choices were inextricably linked. In a sense, people were their diet in a way that few of us can really imagine now, with the remoteness the general population has from the origins of what they eat and the species that adorn their plates. But one thing that remains, though again we don't often think much about it, is just how much we have our identities wrapped up in the foods we eat. Food choices tell us a lot about who we are, just as archaeological traces of food can help us understand who we've been. Take class as an example. Today, there's probably foods you think of as beneath you, things you wouldn't eat. And there's likely foods you think of as too pretentious for you, in other words, above your perceived class status. That's just one example, but as you'll hear in this interview, throughout time, food has been about a lot more than just the calories and micronutrients we've needed. It's defined us and our place in our culture's cosmology. Though times have changed, and food certainly have too, maybe this one thing has stayed the same. Food, though different, still in a lot of ways defines us. It's who we are. But of course, let's see what Robyn Cutright has to say about it. After all, she wrote a book on the topic. Robyn Cutright, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I have been, well, first of all, let me just say your book, The Story of Food in the Human Past, I have referenced probably 3 or 4 times on this podcast now. It seems like every interview I've done lately, something triggers me to something I've read recently in your book. So still working through the book, but really loving it and just really excited to talk to you today. So thank you for your incredible work and thanks for being here.
Oh, that's so great to hear. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. And I always love to talk about food. So yeah, ask away. I'm happy to talk about it.
Could you give us a little perspective on your academic background, your interests, and then tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, so I am an archaeologist. My area of focus is Latin America and Peru. So when I'm not teaching at Center College here in central Kentucky, I am often on the coast of Peru excavating sites kind of before the Inca and trying to use how people lived and what food they ate, what they threw away as a way to understand kind of some of the big dynamics of conquest and change in that part of the world. So yeah, I've been an archaeologist here at Center for about 13 years. I teach a pretty wide variety of courses. So in addition to my specific research topic, I've been teaching kind of broadly about anthropology and food since I've been here at Center. And so the book comes out of a class that I teach here called Paleo Kitchen, the Archaeology of Food. I taught the class a couple of times and I love seeing the questions that students have and kind of getting them excited about why we eat what we do and how archaeologists study that. And I realized that there wasn't really a book that I fully covered what I would like to talk about in the class that I could assign as a textbook. So I decided to write that book, but I didn't want to think of it just as a textbook, with end of chapter questions and bolded vocabulary words. I wanted to kind of take what I teach in that class and explain it for a general audience who's interested in food or interested in the past, and in a way that would also work for my students.
I like the book because, first of all, I do like routine library purges because I get too many books eventually. This one's sticking around. It's not going anywhere. It's going to stay in the library. And what I like about it, it's very readable, but it's also academic. It's really well referenced. And so it's kind of a nice mix as a layperson. I find it readable, but also authoritative. So yeah, I really like that about it.
Yeah. Archaeologists have been studying food. Well, I mean, that's a question that's gone pretty far back in archaeology, but there's just so much literature, and every year more and more studies are getting published, but they're getting published in journals behind paywalls for a very specific audience of other experts, right? And so I kind of, I see what I'm doing in the book as trying to synthesize and translate a lot of the conversations that are happening within professional journals and conferences and the kind of archaeological professional literature out to the public who isn't necessarily interested in wading through 30-page journal articles, but wants to know kind of what we're finding and what we're talking about.
One thing I've wanted to ask you is when you look out at the contemporary food landscape today, particularly I often jokingly call what we see today the diet wars. Maybe you have like a spectrum of fad diets where you sort of have on one end maybe the fully plant-based folks, and on the other extreme you'd have the fully carnivore folks. And I always joke that, hey, everybody's playing with a suite of like 30 foods here, and they're just reorganizing them into all these different so-called diets. But it's like compared to, let's say, the Haza eating 800 species a year, like you're all just playing with the same deck of cards here and calling them different diets. But when you look out at the I'd almost say confusion that we have about what we're like even supposed to eat or how we should eat or what we should eat, with the lens that you see through like big human history, how do you see where we are today with food, and particularly, I guess, like the struggles we have, just like figuring out, what to put in our mouth each morning?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think I have two approaches to answering it, right? One is that when you look at the big swath of both human history and then also the cultures that exist today around the world, you see that there's no one human diet, right? So the attempts by different fad diets or kind of different ways of thinking about food to say, well, this is the best way. These are the things you should eat. Eat this, not that. This is what humans do best on. Doesn't really match up with what you see when you look around at different human groups, and you see people eating a really wide range of things, from really heavily plant-based diets to really heavily meat-based diets, and kind of anywhere in between, based on the environment that they live in, based on kind of their way of going about producing or finding food in the landscape. So I think attempts to kind of narrow down to this is the one healthy diet miss the point that humans are really adapted for a wide range of diets, that we traditionally eat and survive well on a pretty wide range of foods. We're what an ecologist would call generalists, right? We can, we're not locked in like maybe a koala is to eating eucalyptus or something like that.
A specialist,
we're not specialists. And so there is no one way that humans eat, or I would say should eat. So that's one place my mind goes when I think about fad diets, with those books with like or websites with like the table of foods that are okay for you to eat, and you have to make up all of your meals out of them, whether they're low fat or low carb or whatever it is.
The book titles are often like the something diet or the something miracle. It's always like,
right.
It's like how I know it's a fad,
Right, because there's no miracle food, right? But then I also think that those books are doing they're fulfilling a need that people have to have those choices narrowed down, right? So we can eat a really wide variety of things. So that's a lot of cognitive load to try to wade through that and figure out what makes sense to eat. And so the diets actually, I think they help us do that. Michael Pollan, who, famous food writer, talks about how in the United States, what we see is this sort of reliance on science or medicine to tell us what to eat in the absence of a really strong traditional culinary framework, right? That sort of, you learn from your grandmother and your mother what to eat. That's what you make. That's what your kids make. This kind of culinary tradition of what's considered to be an appropriate meal. We don't really have that broadly shared in the United States. And so I think that's also another reason why we turn to these fad diets or these tables on the website, because it makes it easy to try to figure out what a meal should look like for us.
That kind of leads me actually to a good jumping off point here, because something you point out in the book, I don't know, it just sort of like hit me so hard. I'm amazed. I've spent 20 years thinking about food professionally. I don't know how I've ever really missed this distinction that you make, but it's obvious. It's probably a very obvious one in your field, but one that I just had never thought about. So you make this distinction between diet and cuisine, and it's like, so I do a TV show about wild foods, and a lot of folks who do similar shows to me are really into cuisine. So a big part of it is what they cook at the end. I often bring the ingredients to chefs to see what they cook because I'm more interested in the diet part.
Hmm.
So like I'm fascinated by what species we eat and can
Right.
eat. And I guess it's been less exciting to me personally in my own profession, like what those can become. Although I
Hmm.
enjoy that part too, but it helped me to understand myself a little bit better and my work. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about diet and cuisine, how they're different, and in particular, sort of where that leads. Because in your book, it's like we really learn that like the identity of a culture, it has a lot
Hmm.
to do with its cuisine.
Yeah. So the difference between diet and cuisine is the diet is the set of foods that you eat. So, like you said, the different species that we actually put in our bodies and ingest, and even the different ratios of, let's say, carbs to protein, and what actually just makes up the food that we ingest, and that we share with animals too. Right? Animals have diets. They eat particular combinations of foods in different ratios. But then cuisine is something that humans do, because cuisine is cultural. Cuisine takes those ingredients and it transforms them into meals. So we don't just eat. I mean, we do eat a collection of plants and animals, right, on our table, but we transform them in simple ways or complex ways, adding flavors, cooking them in different ways to make what we consider to be a sort of an appropriate meal, or something that looks like a meal. It looks like an inviting dish to us. And so that's where culture comes in. And then the other pieces of cuisine are sort of, well, how many meals a day do you have, and when do you have them, and who do you have them with, and what do they look like? All of these things we different human cultures do differently, because they're really not determined by our biology. They're determined by our traditions and our identity, and what we think is appropriate, what comes down to us through our culture as being an appropriate taste for food to have. So I think you can really think about this difference if you think about an ingredient that's really commonly used across lots of different cuisines. So you can think about something like potatoes. Right. So, potatoes were domesticated in the Andes. They're an Andean food, but they're part of a lot of different cuisines around the world. But they look and taste differently. They're kind of on the plate in different forms. So, aloo gobi in India, right, and potato latkes, or French fries. So the same ingredient and the same sort of dietary contribution plays out differently across different cuisines, because we're sort of adding in our cultural expectations for what that food should look like and taste like.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how I guess cuisines get updated because if you ask the average person who wasn't aware of sort of domestication centers around the world and you're like, hey, where do potatoes come from? They might say,
Right.
I don't, Ireland. Or if you said, where do you think tomatoes come from? They might say Italy, not
Hmm.
realizing these things both come from, South America. And so, I guess we associate foods from one place often with one type of cuisine, not really realizing where they came from. But going back to your other point too about what's appropriate to eat or what we think of as a meal, another thing you brought up in the book that just really had me laughing. You give this equation A plus 2B, and
Right.
I want to give you a second to explore that. But I'll just say this one more piece, which is I end up on the road a lot, and when I'm on the road, and sometimes it's like you're living off basically snack foods, or what'll be like, you piece together a meal from a bunch of different
Hmm.
packaged foods, and it's so unsatisfying to me. And I've always wondered because I'm like, I know I'm covering the spectrum of macro, micronutrients I need. I've
Hmm.
got the caloric density I need. Why do I leave that feeling unsatisfied? And I'm wondering if you could speak to that and what that equation means.
Yeah, so that equation comes out of the work of Mary Douglas, who is a British writer about the kind of. She takes a very symbolic perspective on food. So she suggests that, so beyond just, it's not the plants and animals and the species that you eat, it's kind of the culinary framework that you have for how to eat. She thinks about that as being very symbolic and very kind of imbued with a structure. And so she talks about this A plus 2B as the equation for, well, she's British, so she's writing about British food. may or may not be true for each of your listeners. But as she describes it, the idea is that a meal, to be a proper meal, the sort of structure of the meal should have a stressed element, and then two sort of side or less stressed elements. So if you want to think about, a steak, that's the A, because if somebody asks, what are you having for dinner? You say steak. But then the steak usually isn't alone on the plate, right? The steak usually has sides. So it might have like green beans and baked potato or something like that. And those would be the two unstressed elements. And what Mary Douglas thinks is really interesting is how you see that structure repeated at different scales. So, what are you having for dinner? Steak with baked potato and green beans. But then that's the main course. And so that becomes the A of the meal, because you might have an appetizer and dessert as the two unstressed elements at kind of the meal scale. And then maybe even you could move up and think about the day, right? You have dinner, and then you have lunch and breakfast. So at each of these scales, you see this sort of structure repeating itself. And Mary Douglas says that's how you know that you've had a proper meal, because it fits into that structure, or sort of had a proper day. And that's why she would say you feel unsatisfied when you've just snacked or, cobbled together some elements from the, airport convenience store or something like that. Like, you've had enough calories to get your body moving, but your brain doesn't think that you've had a meal because you haven't fulfilled that structure. Or you've grazed all day and just sort of snacked all day, but you haven't had a real meal. She says that structure can tell you that a meal is real or not.
Is that transcultural, or is that something that is largely a Western idea?
Right. So that structure, that specific equation, would be determined by your culture. There are other structures that are out there. Maybe it's easiest to think about what's the big meal of the day, or how many meals you have in a day, or how many courses are normal to consume for you. But then also, I think I mentioned in the book that every time I teach Mary Douglas in my classes, all of the international students from China say, that is not how we think about a meal. A meal is rice and then a bunch of other plates, dishes that have a couple of ingredients that are meant to go with the rice. And they say, I don't know how these American students have like one plate of food at the cafeteria. That's not a satisfying meal because it's not enough variety. So Mary Douglas would say every cuisine has that structure, but the structure itself is going to be different based on each cuisine or each culture. So we all have a structure. Yeah.
Different equations.
Yeah.
Throughout the book, you say food is good to think. And I was wondering if you could explore that a little bit too for our listeners, and like, what does that mean?
Yeah, so that's a famous quote in anthropology. This idea that, and I think what it's really trying to get at is that because we're so cultural, humans, we just like to think about our world, and we spend a lot of time trying to make sense of how our society is structured, who we are, what our place in the world is, and that's, a lot of anthropologists would say that's kind of how what culture is, right? Is how humans tell ourselves who we are. That's a famous quote by another anthropologist. So if culture is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, then food is a really sort of fertile or rich area that we use to kind of think about who we are. We also say in very kind of a more colloquial or more common quote would be, you are what you eat, right? Mm-hmm. And so we don't just put plants and animals in our mouths, right? We make them into meals. We learn about other people by by trying their cuisine. We really use it as a way to try to understand our world and to think about who we are and to show others who we are. So yeah, we're cultural animals, and food is a huge part of that cultural expression.
Yeah, going back to the fad diet idea, one thing that strikes me, having been a part of some of those cultures in my past and really having to like unwind myself, because they can get very cult-like, mm-hmm. and they typically have an ism attached to it. So, whenever you have an ism, it's like, you got your identity wound into that thing. I feel like, mm-hmm. and so it seems like one of the things we're always trying to do is, those of us who are into food is like define ourselves in some way
Mhm.
through what we eat. And so recently I was traveling with two guys who were in their late 70s, and they were telling me about, well, they just said this thing that really stood out to me, and I had been reading your book at the time, so it kind of they clicked together for me. He said, they both said, when we were growing up, everything was about food. They lived rurally, and
Hmm.
they were just like all day. He's like, we were all happy, but all day was about food. It was like
Hmm.
either growing food or hunting food or fishing food or for whatever it was. Like that's how they lived, and I guess I just wanted to ask, like, how is that the big picture of human history, really? I mean, because right now, here we are like drowning in calories. I mean, it's
Mhm.
amazing that we're dealing with, obesity would be maybe the most obvious one, but then so many other diseases of just excessive food and maybe like a lack of the exercise you would usually need to acquire that food.
Mhm.
But this is a relatively new phenomenon, right? I mean, even in the last probably 150 years, has there been such opulence calorically?
Mhm.
But would you say that most, especially, I know you've done a lot of work down in Peru and stuff. It's like, has food usually been the main thing that we're doing and thinking about?
Yeah, I think it really has. I think that you're right that we're living in a sort of a unusual moment when it comes to the food that's available, and I think that in the past there were people who had that kind of opulence or who had that access to food, but they were the most elite people, right? Maybe just a few people had the calories and the variety. That's another real outlier. We're living in a world of incredible variety that's available
Mhm.
to us, accessible to us in grocery stores, this kind of global food chain at our fingertips, which is really unusual when it comes to human history. So people did have access, but not everybody, or not the bulk of people in a society the way that we see now. And so it wasn't the kind of widespread problem. But yeah, I think in the past, most people would have spent part of their day preparing food or procuring food, and they would have spent a lot of time at it. And in foraging societies, in traditional farming societies, almost everybody is involved in food production. It's only when you get to really efficient industrial agricultural production that you see the percentage of people who are involved in procuring and producing food get so small. I can't remember the exact figure, but something like 2% of Americans or
Wow.
4% of Americans are farmers. So actually involved in producing the bulk of food that we eat. And that number has never been that small. Right. And
Wow.
so yeah, this is a really unusual moment when most of us are disconnected from food procurement and production, or we do it as a hobby, right? I have a garden in my backyard, and my husband has bees, and we used to have chickens, but we're not sustaining ourselves on that. That's
Right.
sort of a fun hobby, and then we go to work as professors and lawyers and make money to buy food out of the global food chain. So yeah, this is a really unusual moment in terms of the broad scope of human history.
That's interesting you say that. My show here is about wild food, and so I hunt and gather as a hobbyist.
Hmm.
And it's this very rapidly growing community of people who are doing that. And then, like you mentioned, people are gardening at small scale or doing practicing animal husbandry at small scale, or whatever it is, like producing
Hmm.
things at home. It seems like there's a deep desire in people to get access. Do you think that that's just because of what we just talked about, this idea that so few people are, I mean, this is so deeply ingrained in us?
Hmm.
How do you perceive that, people wanting to get involved in their food again, even though in some ways it's almost like detrimental? Like, I spend so much time on this stuff that I could spend, succeeding in other ways or something, and instead I'm out there processing acorns or wild rice or something.
Right.
But how do you perceive all that, especially when you're there, working in your garden? Like, obviously you see this from a bigger picture perspective.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I would stop short of saying that we have some sort of primal urge to do it to obtain our own food. I'm not sure I would go that far, but I do think it is satisfying. I
Mhm.
think it's if humans use food as part of kind of our culture and our identity, and we think a lot about it, then I think wanting to be part of producing it, or wanting high quality food, or wanting to kind of know where that food comes from, can make sense. I do think, though, it is really satisfying. And I think for me, one of the things that's important about it is the knowledge, right? So in moments in the past when everybody was involved in growing food and also preparing food, right? So there's the food procurement side, but then there's also, how do you make it edible? How do you make it safe to eat? How do you preserve it so that you can have it when it's not right out of the field or the forest? All of that required an incredible amount of knowledge that everybody pretty much had to have to survive. And some of that knowledge, I feel like, is runs the risk of getting lost. I mean, I think it's preserved in books, but there's, as you know, if you're a forager, right, there's a lot of embodied knowledge that comes along with foraging or with farming. How things feel. Does this seem right? Does this seem off? Where do you go to find a particular kind of resource, or how do you preserve it? And so I do think it's kind of intellectually, but also personally interesting for me to learn that stuff and then to try to put it into practice, so that I actually know how to do it, not just read about how to do it. Right. So I don't know if it's sort of a primal human setting, but certainly it's something that's connected to our identities and connected to this sort of deep history of human knowledge that we have about food that a lot of us aren't practicing.
As you're well aware, there's been trade routes throughout history that have brought people exotic foods, but I would imagine that through most of human history, again up until probably the Industrial Revolution, that most people would have recognized the species behind the foods that they ate, behind their cuisine, until now, where like people can eat things their whole life and never see the animal or see the plant. So it's like something about gardening is you're like, this is what a lettuce looks like. This is what a carrot looks like when it's an intact organism, or here's what a haddock looks like, or whatever it might be. Because I think
it's not just a fish stick.
Yeah, like people know the body parts and they can maybe recognize that once it's been prepared into the cuisine part, but very often don't recognize the species. I think it just leaves human beings kind of like, all we have is other human beings, like not these other species to interact with. So I think that's a big part of it for me, is just wanting to interact with species besides people, dogs, and cats, and maybe ginkgo trees or whatever it is.
Right. Right. In fact, richer. I had a student last semester tell me that they had learned about the idea of genus and species in biology, and they had never thought about food as having genus and species names. Which, I think that just reinforces that kind of disconnect that you mentioned.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I'm teaching a group of elementary school kids next week, and part of what I want to ask them about is, what is food? Because when I think what is food, I think of, well, it's basically the bodies and body parts of other living things. It's kind of grim to say it, but it's like that. What's on your plate are body parts or whole bodies. Right. And, occasionally, I guess with dairy, let's say it's like a liquid tissue or of an animal or something, but it's like body parts. But I think that it's like kids don't often realize that it's almost like these things are, obviously we don't eat rocks and dirt and, non-living things, but I don't know that everyone realizes that. So
yeah, but that also might be a product of how we eat in the U.S. I know that when I'm in Peru, for instance, it's not uncommon to see the whole fish, eye and all on your plate, or guinea pig is eaten in the Andes. And so it's served, sometimes just spit roasted. So you see its little feet and its little head.
Yeah, they always leave the head on
yeah, it's little claws. So that also might not be a modern condition so much as a product of processed food in the U.S.
That's a great distinction. If I understand it right, I spent a little time in Peru. A lot of times they raise them right in the kitchen as well, right? I think that's really cool. So that
the first time I had guinea pig, I was a sophomore in college doing study abroad, and we showed up in a rural kitchen, and the we were eating soup while the guinea pig was being prepared for later. So it was being kind of stuffed with some herbs, and it had just been skinned. And then there were living guinea pigs kind of around the corner underneath the stove. So it was kind of the whole scope of everything right there in front of me to consider while I ate my soup.
Hey, don't skip ahead. I need your help. We've just started filming for season 3 of our TV show, WildFed. We're still looking for a few good episode ideas, so if you have a hunt or a forage you think is perfect for the show, please reach out to info@wild-fed.com and let us know what you're thinking. Each episode features a plant or mushroom as well as an animal, and of course a cook or chef who knows how to handle wild ingredients. Also, season 2 of WildFed is now on the air, with 10 new episodes airing on Outdoor Channel Monday nights at 7:30 p.m. Eastern and again at 10:30 p.m. This week is the season finale, and this one is really special to me. It stars just 2 people, myself and my wife Avani, and follows us as I hunt squirrels and she gathers acorns. You'll see how we process acorns, break down squirrels, and what we like to cook with them. I'll be preparing acorn-breaded fried squirrel legs, and Avani will be making an acorn and maple dessert bread. You'll even see the acorn flour deconstructed crouton I make for our salad. It's my favorite episode of the season, so be sure to check that one out. If you don't have cable, and let's face it, most of us don't, you can watch the show live as it airs on friendlytv.com. That's spelled friendly without the vowels, FRNDLY TV.com. You can get a free trial subscription if you want to watch this Monday's episode, and after that, it's just $6.99 a month. Here at WildFed, we're so proud to have a second season on the air, and we really hope you'll tune in either on Outdoor Channel or friendlytv.com. Now, back to the show. Having had an interest in wild foods versus domesticated foods means that, of course, I've spent a lot of time looking at the literature on domestication and the Neolithic Revolution. And it's like so heavily skewed towards the Middle East, Mesopotamia or whatever, like where wheat was domesticated. And I feel like there's probably cultural reasons for this, but like, often people don't maybe realize the degree to which places like Peru and Mesoamerica play a tremendous role in this story. I kind of get us off track here a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can speak to that because, when it comes to, so many of the foods that we celebrate today, you brought up the potato, like what an important food it is to us, the tomato, maize, course, coming out of Mexico. Can you talk a little bit about the domestication of food and species in general in South America and how important that whole kind of, I guess, Peru up into Mexico and even up into the middle southern United States? Can you talk a little bit about that domestication complex and maybe why we know less about that or hear less about that than we hear about wheat and barley and things like that?
Ooh, there's a lot of directions to go with that question. When you were saying that we focus on Mesopotamia, but maybe not South America or Mexico, I was thinking, being here in Kentucky, which is, I think, an even lesser known area, this kind of southeastern agricultural complex that consists of a lot of plants that we actually don't eat too much anymore. So in addition to sunflower, plants in the quinoa family, Quinopodium, goosefoot, which I was actually just reading about how it's becoming a huge pest in crop fields. And I was thinking maybe we just need to start eating it again.
They're becoming resistant to glyphosate, I believe, right?
Yes. Yeah, that was the article I was reading. So I was like, well, maybe we just need to embrace it and embrace the southeastern agricultural complex. But all of these kind of oily or starchy seeded plants, plus squash and sunflower that were kind of domesticated around Kentucky, Tennessee, southeastern part of the U.S. And then they were kind of supplanted by corn when corn got here, and we don't eat them now. So I think that's probably part of the answer for why we don't really know that much about that one.
If I could break in on that, do you mean supplanted by corn when Europeans started to plant it? Or do you mean when maize actually arrived kind of village by village and made its way there?
Yeah, so maize made its way from where it was originally domesticated, which is kind of central Mexico, the central Balsas River region. In fact, as genetic evidence is telling us, we can be kind of specific about where some of that domestication started to happen. But
where was that, you said? I'd like to
so it's in central Mexico, the Balsas River region of Mexico, specifically Balsas. Okay. But there's been so much genetic work on the domestication of corn because it's in part because we're so reliant on it, right? Trying to understand its genetics is really important to us because we grow so much corn. But anyway, corn was domesticated there. And it made its way both north and south actually pretty quickly. And but it took a little while to adapt as it moved farther north. So it went to the US Southwest first and was adopted by people there, and then kind of eventually made its way into the Mississippi River basin, and then eventually all the way up to, New York and places that are really different environmentally from where it was originally domesticated. So that took a while, that process of adaptation. When it arrived in kind of Kentucky and the Mississippi River area, it was added to those crops that people were already gardening, and people were doing this kind of mixed gardening and foraging pattern. And so corn got added in, but then corn can produce a lot of calories. And so it became a bigger and bigger part of what people were growing over time. So maybe around 1,000 to 1,200, it started to pop up at big Mississippian sites like Cahokia, which is this site right outside of modern-day St. Louis. And maybe corn made possible some of these larger communities that we see later in prehistory. So it was already here and spread throughout the southeast and the eastern part of the U.S. by the time that Europeans arrived.
Yeah, it was actually up here in Maine, being grown in the river floodplains and stuff. So it's really fascinating.
Well, and it's pretty amazing to think about, the growing season is so much shorter up there compared to central Mexico, that just so much selection and breeding had to be done by these early farmers to, get a variety of corn that would actually work up there. It's pretty amazing. But
yeah, it's like a slippery genome that can just be sort of shaped into so many different, or adapted to so many different places.
It took a while to figure out where corn was from because it looks so different from its wild ancestor. Teosinte, the wild ancestor, is just, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's basically like this big bunch of grass, just this tall grass, and the seed heads are really tiny, and it doesn't really look like corn at all. So and those
seed heads don't grow 360 around it the way we think of a cob either. They look sort of like any grass you'd see, right?
They're much more grass-like, and they're covered in this hard pericarp, and they don't really you can't just eat them the same way that you eat kernels of corn. You have to kind of peel them. Apparently you can pop them like popcorn, but they definitely, it's not like some foragers stood there in the, Balsas River drainage 9,000 years ago and looked at that teosinte and said, oh yes, I can feed my family on this. That's not what happened. So yeah, I think that in part because that process has been a little harder for archaeologists to understand than the process of wheat and barley domestication in Mesopotamia. But I think, I think also another thing that's made it hard to understand is that when you're thinking about central Mexico, that's pretty dry. That's where we found some of the first domesticated corn and chili peppers in caves in Oaxaca and other states in that area. And on the coast of Peru, where I work, it's also really dry. And so we have some really old corn preserved. But to get to Peru from Mexico, corn had to move. And when I say corn moved, I mean it was probably the seeds were swapped from group of forager to group of forager kind of down the line. It wasn't that people were moving, most likely. It was that people were sharing seeds. And just the same way that you see farmers share seeds today when they get together or there's seed swaps, foragers were probably swapping seeds and planting, and kind of that's how early corn moved down the line over the course of a couple thousand years down to South America. But it's moving through really tropical areas like Panama and Colombia, and down the eastern side of the continent into the Amazon. And so it's only been in the last several decades that we've had analytical techniques that let us see the microscopic remains of corn that are preserved in those tropical environments. So it's been a little bit harder to sort of see some of that until recently. And that might be one reason that it's overlooked. But I also think that, one narrative is really simple, right? We can look at what happened in Mesopotamia. Western scientists looking at that feel that kind of, that's the tradition that we're part of, and it kind of makes sense. But it's more complicated when you start looking at these other centers of domestication. China's a really early one. Mexico's a really early one, because it actually didn't happen in the same way in all of those places. So it makes the story a lot more complicated, a lot less easy to tell as this simple narrative. And so that could be another reason that we just don't hear as much about these alternate trajectories, because it makes the story much more complicated.
When one thing though that is similar, if you look, at the Mesopotamian domestication events center around a grass, the Chinese center around a grass, the Mexican centers around a grass. It's so funny today to see the grain-free diets, which I understand,
Yeah.
and I know there's some issues with some of the modern grains and how they were developed and all of that. But
Mhm.
it is funny, like, hey, these are really important foods to people, and
Yeah.
even pre-agriculturally, it's not like we didn't eat any grains. So I find that
Right.
amusing. But I wanted to ask about Peru specifically because, the potato quinoa, which,
Mhm.
to the average person appears like a grain, but obviously isn't one.
Mhm.
It's a seed of one of the goosefoots, right? So was there a grain? Was the Incan civilization built without a grain?
No,
And
they had corn.
so it had come south to them.
Corn came south to them. So it seems like foragers started to mess around with teosinte, or a mutated version of teosinte that looked a lot more like corn, maybe as early as 9,000 years ago.
Oh,
And easily by 5,000 years ago, corn was being grown in the central Andes, and so it was introduced through this kind of down the line trading and movement, and it obviously offered something that people liked. So it had that good starchy quality. I would say I would add to your list of grasses, potato, but also sweet potatoes and yams and cassava. There's also some tubers that are big early domestic hits, bananas, but they're all starchy, right? That they all kind of, all of these early centers of domestication have this sort of starchy staple that emerges, often alongside something like a bean or a pulse or a kind of protein source, and often alongside something like an oily seed like flax or sunflower or something like that.
for the lipids.
Yeah, for the lipids. And then actually we overlook it, but things like chilies that provide flavor.
Yeah.
That's obviously not a dietary cornerstone, but we
But
do
a
see those in
cuisine
the early
cornerstone,
domestic
right?
hits there. Yeah, a cuisine cornerstone. Yeah, so people
Yeah.
aren't just looking for calories, right? They're looking for
Right.
dishes, delicious meals. So we can't overlook that. But yeah, so corn was adopted and adapted to the Andes. And so by the time the Inca started spreading, which was really in this broad swath of history, just a blink of an eye ago, maybe
Yeah,
in
very
the
short-lived culture, right?
1400s, very short-lived culture. They really prioritized corn. They grew it wherever they could. Corn can't grow up in the highest altitudes of the Andes, and so areas that could grow corn were really highly prized by the Inca, probably because they were making it into beer. So
Mm-hmm.
one thing that corn is really good at is being converted into
Chicha.
alcohol. Chicha, yeah, and so better than potatoes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was desired. It was already in the Andes. It was a cornerstone of a diet, but it was also doing something else really important for them, which was allowing them to brew beer.
There's few things I like as much as walking into a chicheria with a huge bag of coca and
Oh yeah.
feeding everybody in there and drinking chicha all night. But I, I let me go a layer deeper on that question about grasses, because I guess the next level to that question for me is, while of course a culture that practices some kind of agronomy can exist without a grain, can a city state be built without a grain? And because grains are so fungible and storable compared to a lot of the other starchy plants we talked about,
Yeah.
and it's amazing, like seeing the Peruvian ability to almost like freeze dry potatoes in
Yeah,
the
I was just thinking
altitude and
about
the way
that.
they can store them. It's incredible. But by and large, like grains are really unique in that way. So when I think about places that had actual city states and citadels and, these big cities, is that possible in the absence of grains, do you think?
I'm trying to think of counterexamples, but I think you do definitely need a couple of elements that grains are really good at, right? You need to be able to store you need to be able to produce a surplus. So you need to have a situation where one farmer can produce more food than that farmer needs to feed their family, and that surplus can be stored, and that it can be transported in that stored form, so that it can kind of support people who are doing other pieces of the economy, and pieces who, also to support the elites, or whoever it is that's kind of in charge. So you need a staple that can provide enough calories, that can be stored, that can be grown in surplus, kind of intensified, right? Whereas if you add more inputs into that field, be it animal fertilizer or labor or irrigation or whatever, it can grow more. And so I don't think that we don't have any cities in the ancient world that don't have that. I hope I'm not lying about that, but I can't think of any great examples. So grains have been really good at that, and I don't think that we have anything that works quite as well as
They're
grains,
like
right?
the
Because you
currency
do
of a
have
city state, huh?
yeah, well, it was in places like ancient Egypt or in Sumerian cities. That's how people would get paid, in measures of grain, or that's how rations would be provided for laborers in bread or beer or grain, as kind of standardized measures. So I guess that's another thing that grains are good at, is they can kind of be standardized, right? And just here's a quantity that stands for a day's labor or whatever.
When I see people obsessing over their lawns, I think about that. It's like somehow this like remnant, this like obsession with grass, like being out in, let's say, Arizona and watching people just try to force grass into existence, or I've heard
Oh my
about
gosh.
in Iraq where sort of elite families would use almost the material that's in a diaper that holds water so that they could get lawns going. And I think like, just humans just love their grass, man.
Yeah. Well, that
No.
makes me think of actually, like the other systems of agriculture, and other ways of living. So house lot gardens in places like Costa Rica or Mexico. When I've had students study abroad there, one of the assignments I give them is go with your host family and have them show you all of the plants around their house. And because it's generally not a just monoculture of grass with
Right.
some azaleas or something there. It's usually like, well, here's an avocado tree, and here's some chili plants that are kind of just there, and so rather than having lawns, they actually have foodscapes in their backyards, and students have, like, they're not primed to see that, so they don't even realize that all those plants are edible that are
Right.
around the house.
Yeah, good point. Good point. There's this component of your book which I think is really important. I want to explore a little bit with you, and that's the role of, or the relationship between food and cuisine, and then gender and class and things like that. And I think, and correct me if this is wrong, but I sort of look at it as, as we move along the timeline from being foragers to being farmers, we kind of make a movement from egalitarianism to classism. And also that's true on the individual sovereignty level, but then it's like
Mm-hmm.
also true on the gender and racial inequality levels as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, if that's accurate. And then also, could you explore that particularly maybe along the time, the roughed out timeline of how these things played out and how they affected gender and created class in a sense?
That's a pretty complicated question, because that I think when you zoom out, it seems like this really neat timeline of like
Yeah,
foragers existed and then
sure.
farmers came along, but and then all of them are sort of, all foragers are basically one way, and farmers, then so you see the development of class. And if you zoom in, it's actually way more complicated than that. It doesn't work out as like this nice big directional timeline, because even when some people started to farm, there were still foragers around, and some foragers
Right.
actually did have classes, like the Pacific coast of the US and Canada, those Pacific Northwest. They had enough surplus, all
I
the
was just going to
salmon
say
and just
that's a
like the
unique
rich marine
spot though.
resources. That's a unique spot.
So much
But
food on a foraging level because
yeah.
they didn't have, if I understand it right, in the Pacific Northwest there was a lot less of that annual migratory pattern
Hmm.
because they didn't need to follow food because they had those surpluses right there on the coast, largely, I think, right?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. That is such a rich environment for foragers that people there were sedentary, so they didn't move or
That's
follow
just
resources
amazing.
in a
Wow.
seasonal round. Yeah, it really is. So the interesting thing is we think about that as a real outlier, as a really rich environment for foragers to live in, and I think it might be true that when we think about foragers, people who forage for a living, we think about something like the Hadza in Tanzania or the people living in the Kalahari or people living in the Arctic or something like that. And the reason that we think about those as our examples of foraging societies is those are people who are pushed to the margins by farmers.
Right.
So those are the territories that they sort of where they were able to, where foragers were able to persist because they were areas that farmers were not super interested in. So if you think about like before farming, foragers would have had the opportunity to live in some really incredibly rich environments.
Good point.
We just don't see them around because farmers, you could produce more kids on grain. It just provides the basis for larger populations.
Right.
And the people in the Pacific Northwest, they had class. They actually had slaves and nobles, all because of but they were still foragers. So, I just want to kind of start my answer by saying it's not just one kind of arrow moving us toward greater and
Right.
greater
That's a really great
hierarchy, kind of when we
distinction.
zoom in.
Yeah.
But I do think that if grain provides a community with the possibility of surplus, right, then it becomes possible for haves and have-nots to exist, or for that kind of social or class distinctions to really appear and really get become generational in a way that you don't see as often in many foraging societies. So I think it did provide some opportunities for political and economic differences and hierarchies to really be perpetuated. And so we see that in a lot of ancient societies, right? We see these nobles and commoners and people being distinguished by the kind of resources that they had, the amount of surplus they could store, and the kind of food that they were eating, their access to exotic foods, their access to high quality meat cuts, and their access to just large, abundant meals. We definitely see that in a lot of places and times in ancient agricultural societies kind of emerge and then be perpetuated over the generations. So food becomes kind of both a way that archaeologists read those economic distinctions and probably a way that people put on display their wealth by being able to host feasts or by being able to eat fancy foods. So it was kind of something that they were using to display and reinforce class differences. And then it's also an easy way for archaeologists to see those in the past.
You write a bit about the cuisine of the slavery culture in the south of the United States. Could you speak to that a little bit, and then how that's reflected today? Because it's a lot of that, we still see the remnants of that today. So in the cuisine of the South, could you talk a little bit about that? I think that gives good context to all of this too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot of really interesting work that's being done by archaeologists on places where enslaved people lived in plantations in the South. I think that's really important work because the people who were eating in those quarters were not often the people who are writing the accounts of what happened in the past. That's actually, just to kind of zoom out, that's one of the reasons I think studying food is so interesting in general, because the people who are cooking in the kitchens and the people who are eating meals are not always the people who are producing the documents that historians use to like reconstruct the past.
Yeah.
So it's a very democratic way, right? Everybody was eating, everybody was producing trash. And so it kind of gives us insight into lives that aren't well represented in the history books. And so enslaved Africans and African Americans are one example of that. And so I think this work is really important because it can, in some cases, the work is supporting some of the narratives that the plantation owners and managers were writing about what they were feeding people, what people were eating. But sometimes it also tells us new information about how people were, for instance, growing food on the side of what they were provided, or in a lot of cases having time and space to fish and forage and add flavor and add substance to the meals that they were being provided, or sometimes even maybe steal cuts of meat from the plantation house kitchen, so as an act of resistance. So all of this is able to be discerned a little bit from the trash, from the excavations of
These middens, basically?
the middens. Yeah, I mean, that's what archaeologists study, right? Is that ancient people's trash. So this is no different. But yeah, so from the middens, from the excavations, we can kind of discern some of these acts of resistance or acts of humanity that were possible within kind of that extremely violent structure. And I really think that's an important perspective. And then, yeah, I was just teaching yesterday. Are you familiar with Michael Twitty's work? He's written a book called The Cooking Gene that's part memoir and part history of African and African American cuisine. He writes about how people who were brought from Africa brought their culinary traditions, ingredients like okra, but also kind of ways of preparing food.
Okra's
and
from
when
Africa?
they What's that? Okra's from Africa.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, I didn't know that.
And actually, the word okra is from an African language, West African language. I'm not remembering which one right now. The word gumbo is also from a West African
Cool.
language.
Okay.
So we see this kind of preserved in the way that we talk about Southern food today. But so they were bringing ingredients. Corn was actually already in West Africa by the time the slave trade picked up. So cooks would have been familiar with corn. But then they come to the U.S., right, where they're interacting with different indigenous food traditions and ingredients. So sort of finding corn again here, but then also European traditions. And so we get this synthesis of these various traditions. So we get something like, in a lot of West African culinary traditions, there's some sort of a starchy staple that's kind of in a, like fufu, kind of like a mashed form. And then there's sort of a spicy stew accompaniment of that. So then you get African cooks interacting with Native Americans, learning about nixtamalization, how corn gets processed with lye or with wood ash to kind of change it into a form that makes it more gelatinous and kind of more doughy. And they're stewing this down,
vitamins available in it,
making the B vitamins available. Yeah. And so, that's where shrimp and grits comes from, right? Is cool. This kind of West African, tradition of this starchy, in this case, maize, as the base. And then there's this kind of spicy, stew with a little bit of meat that goes over the top. So, the Southern cuisine that we know today is kind of forged out of this encounter and out of this system of slavery and kind of that crossing the Atlantic moments in ways that I think we don't really think about, right? Oh, that's Southern food. But it actually comes from this encounter and comes from the ability, the kind of amazing ability of enslaved chefs to pull in not just ingredients, but spices and this whole kind of culinary vocabulary and make it an American tradition.
Man, that's really cool. I've got a friend, Tony, down in Savannah, who I do some wild food stuff with. And he recently went out to gather some specimens of a African rice variety. It's in the same genus, Oryza, as, Oryza sativa, the Asian rice. But this must have come over from Africa and was being grown at some level. And now it's sort of feral and abandoned. And he's recently gathered some and is growing it in his home garden. There, I think he went out to one of the islands or something to get it. But that was just fascinating to me. I mean, I had no idea there was a cultivated rice out of Africa.
And in fact, landowners from South Carolina would specifically, I mean, it sounds horrible to say they would specifically try to purchase people who came from rice growing regions of West Africa, who already knew how to grow rice. And so they were basically like, buying the expertise to be able to grow rice in South Carolina. the work of, there's a historian named Judith Carney who's written a lot about this. She wrote a book called Black Rice, and then she also wrote a book called In the Shadow of Slavery, Africa's Botanical Legacy in the Atlantic World. So she has a lot more about these different plants that moved across the Atlantic and how they were, where they came from and how they were used.
Wow. Okay, cool. I'll look into that. And then kind of a side topic here that I just thought was interesting because it's such an important part of our culture today. And I guess is anywhere people figured out the technology to do it. But can you speak to the role that alcohol plays in cuisine and has throughout history? Because it's kind of a fascinating arc.
It is. Yeah. So humans across the world through time seem to have made alcohol when they could. We even see, I think I mentioned in my book, some studies that suggest that that apes and other primates will eat fermented fruits when they have the opportunity to. So, that's something humans are into. So an archaeologist named Brian Hayden, among other people, has suggested that one of the reasons that foragers started to domesticate certain crops, and again, kind of going back to the rice and other grasses and grains that are really starch heavy, is that they provide a good storable base to ferment into alcohol. And so, because if you think about it, you're a forager, right? So the life of a forager isn't horrible. There's a lot of
pretty relaxed
time spent, it's pretty relaxed. And so it's always a big question when we think about the origins of agriculture, right? It's not farmers who are inventing domesticated corn and wheat, it's foragers. So why would a forager want to, move from the pretty relaxed life of a forager, which involves a lot of kind of walking around the landscape? It's probably fairly different from day to day. There's in research on foragers, it doesn't seem like you have to forage 10 hours a day every day to scrape by necessarily.
Can I add something to that too, which is that, I try to point out sometimes like that the Neolithic Revolution isn't over. There are still some groups left who live by hunting and gathering. So this is something that's been going on for many thousands of years and is incomplete still. And my analysis is that most hunting and gathering people are very resistant, and they have to essentially be forced into taking on an agriculturalist lifestyle.
Yes. Yeah, right. So why then did it happen so often in the past? Right? So Hayden and other people would say, why would foragers start to mess around with grasses and these starchy plants? Well, because they wanted to ensure something that they could ferment into beer. So maybe it wasn't worth it for them to, sit down one day and say, I'm going to spend 10 hours a day grinding wheat from now into perpetuity, instead of eating the incredibly wide variety of different species that I've been eating as a forager, with better teeth, with better health, with all this other stuff. Right. And so
life ways.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, nobody has perfect knowledge about what's going to happen over the next millennium based on the choices that they make today. So you can, you can't really blame them for that. But yeah, so it could be that alcohol is attractive to people such that they started to kind of create these domesticates, and then for one reason or another ended up kind of shifting their focus over to something that now had the possibility of sustaining larger communities. And and the other thing that alcohol does is, well, it creates events that people have fun at, people feel bonded with each other, and so it kind of supports a lot of social interactions that we see happening in the past around building political hierarchies or supporting competition between, multiple possible leaders. And so it really kind of, a lot of archaeologists see alcohol as playing a role in a lot of politics in early farming societies, especially.
Man, it's amazing. It's just really fascinating. And it's so much more plausible to me. When I think it's like, yes, bread is wonderful. If you ask my wife, it's like, yes, bread is wonderful. But like the idea that we would give up a Lifeway just for bread is like, I don't know. And then, I know people think like, oh, it's a more, it's like increases your survivability. It's like, I don't know. Then you have droughts and all these things that seem to lead to starvation events and all, malnourishment. And
No, it's
it's
certainly
definitely
true
not.
that when you
Go ahead.
Oh, it's certainly true that when you compare, like if you look at the skeletons of foragers and then, the farmers that maybe replace them in the same region, the foragers are taller, they have better teeth, they probably had better diet, they have less evidence of suffering from malnutrition. So, there's hard evidence to support the fact that the early farmers were not on average as healthy as the foragers in the same region, presumably from the same kind of genetic background, right? So they have the same genes, but they're shorter, which means that they didn't get as much food as children. So yeah, all your eggs are in one basket as a farmer, right? You've got your field, and you better hope that nothing bad happens to it by the time it's ready to harvest. And that's kind of a different calculus than a forager, right? Who also has risk, but also has maybe more mobility or maybe more possibility to focus on different resources because they haven't invested so much labor in just this one field.
I wish we had tools to, I know that they can look at the fossilized enamel of teeth or at caprolites or something to like figure out what people are eating. I wish we had a way to be able to quantify like alcohol consumption, in the skeletal remains or in the archaeological remains, because it would be interesting to see, if that's in fact what was happening. I mean, there aren't tools like that exist, right?
Yeah, but they could, you never know. I feel like we've gotten so much better at archaeological chemistry and some of this other archaeological sciences that who knows. I know that in the Andes in the Americas, but I think the Andes in particular seems to be that a lot of the corn was in the traditional diet might have come in the form of chicha, and so what you certainly
so that left its carbon isotopes
and left its carbon isotopes in people, and so I mean, you're sort of making an assumption. All you see is that C4 plants like corn became a greater part of contributed more to the diet over time. You can't really see that it was in the form of chicha, but we have Spanish accounts saying that chicha was the kind of a big part of people's diets, and so if you do kind of carry that assumption back, it could be that when we see C4 contribution increase, we can imagine that a chunk of that came from chicha. And then some people have looked at, for instance, gender differentials in C4 plant consumption under the Inca Empire, and seen that it seems like males have a greater proportion of their carbon coming through that C4 pathway, so coming from corn, and said maybe men are drinking this corn at feasts or political events that they're participating in, but women aren't. So we can kind of circumstantially think about it, but who knows for the future.
This next question is kind of a one-off, if understandable if it's not something that you know much about. But I was in Kentucky last spring for the Brood 10 cicada hatch, and we made a TV show about that, eating them. And my research tells me, again, as a layperson, that entomophagy is a really transcultural thing. I mean, it's still alive in a lot of places. It seems like just about everywhere in the world, this is something that's practiced, but it seems almost universally reviled now. And I'm wondering about that cultural taboo. If you know anything, if you can speak to this at all, because I know you've really looked at the class distinctions and stuff. And it seems like in the past, insects were seen as a really reliable food source. I almost felt like I just heard a cicada there on the mic. Anyway, yeah, it seems like they were an important food for a long time and provide outstanding nutrition. But wow, of all of the things, I mean, for our show, we've eaten python, we've eaten iguanas, and, reptiles are another one. People aren't really that interested, but nothing grows people out like bugs. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I don't know. So I have a good friend of mine who's an entomologist, and we're getting ready to teach a course in January in Oaxaca in Mexico.
Oh, cool.
And it's going to be on the deep history of human interaction with plants and animals and insects. He's interested in Mexico and Oaxaca because that's not a place where eating insects is reviled, right? Mexican cuisine has a bunch of different insect components, and
most
he's also
Oaxacan
really
restaurants
interested.
you can still get grasshoppers in.
Yeah, no, exactly. There's grasshoppers, there's ant eggs, there's a pretty. It's not just one insect that people,
Right.
think about eating maybe sometime, but they're kind of grossed out by it. It's part of the cuisine, and then also he's really into the cochineal
Oh
insect,
yeah,
which is a
on the
one of the
tuna.
few kind of domesticated insect that the humans use. So
Used for dye, right? Largely because
used for
this is on those
dye. Yeah.
those padded cactuses, like the prickly pear
Mhm.
cactuses they call tuna. Yeah, that's really neat because I
Yeah,
have some.
exactly.
I have a Peruvian. I bought in Cusco a poncho, and it's
Mhm.
got a lot of red dye in it, and that's all from that insect, I believe.
Yeah. So anyway, I guess my initial answer is that they're not necessarily reviled across cultures. I wonder if there's something, I don't know that much about the history of eating insects in European cuisines, but I wonder if there's a piece of like kind of a colonialism piece where maybe if the Europeans looked down on it, then it became kind of, well, you want to seem like you are more European, or you want to escape some discrimination or prejudice, so you're going to kind of move away from insects or move away from a traditional cuisine that's maybe looked down on. I don't really know though if there's a strong European traditions of eating insects
I
or
can't think
not.
of any that I've ever, really come across.
Yeah.
That's
So
interesting.
then I think that would be my guess. I would have to research it, but my guess is because we see that a lot, right? If food is an expression of identity, but you are in a marginalized group, then, moving away from your cuisine and try, sort of adopting the cuisine of a dominant culture or a culture that has more privilege might be a way that you kind of try to um,
Hmm.
navigate a system. And so, yeah, if people get the sense that insects are looked down on, then they might also move away from them, which
Hmm.
leads over time to kind of a distancing. So that would be my hypothesis. But
I would guess
oh,
something similar. Yeah. Um, I guess kind of concluding, I want to ask you about. It seems like when I look at the literature on contemporary hunting and gathering, it's almost always Hadza because there's not many
mhm,
people left doing it. And
yeah.
I think a lot about it. I think about this potentially being, in my lifetime, maybe the last real hunting and
Mhm,
gather, not, real, but like people who are left actually practicing the life way. Because obviously, even amongst the Hadza, it's like a pretty small group of them that still
mhm,
really fully live that way because, they have access to foods from outside and agriculture and things like that. So I'm just curious your thoughts on if we make such a big deal out of the Neolithic revolution. It seems like when the last hunter gatherers are gone, that's like another critical point. I don't know what we'll call it, but it seems like, down the road, archaeologists will look back or anthropologists look back and be like, that was a key moment when the last real hunting and gathering people blinked out or their life way changed. So I was just curious your thoughts on that because it seems like we're very close now, and it could in fact happen while you and I are alive. That besides folks like myself who do it at the hobbyist or practice level, that as an actual life way, it might be gone. What do you think that means for people, and how does that play into the big picture of, like your book is like the story of food in the human past. So
mhm.
like in the big picture of the story of food, what does that mean for us?
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting thing to think about. I mean, the literature talks about the Hadza and a couple of other groups because, those are the ones that are persisting, and man, the patience that the Hadza have shown with
Yeah,
researchers is
it's
really
incredible, right?
incredible. Like if you look
Yeah.
at some of those studies, it's like they let people weigh everything that they ate before they
I
ate it,
know,
or
I know.
test their gut microbiome or something. It's
The
like,
number of people I
we
know who've
really,
gone there and done things with them
oh
where
my
it's like,
gosh.
really? They let you just come there and hang out and eat with them? And that's amazing.
I mean, we really owe a debt of gratitude to the
Hmm.
Hadza's generosity with, helping us understand their life ways in all of our kind of myriad scientific ways. Um, but yeah, so my initial thought is we won't have anybody to send scientists to go study anymore.
Yeah.
Not that that's obviously there's a lot of reasons the Hadza should exist and that their life way should persist if as they want it to without being fodder for scientific studies. But yeah, it will be kind of a closing of a chapter, and I think I think that that's too bad. I think that people who don't think about foraging very much think of it as something that's just kind of like outmoded and lost in the past, and they can't understand why anybody would want to continue that lifestyle once the possibility of agriculture existed, right? And so I always feel like that's a preconception that students come in with, like, why would you want to move around and forage? Why wouldn't you just want to, like, go on your phone and eat corn in a bunch of different chemically produced formats? and so I do think it'll be a loss for human diversity and for our kind of our ability to imagine other ways of living than the way that we live now. It's also so much knowledge that's lost. Hobbyists are keeping it alive, and people who are passing down that knowledge. But, a lot of that knowledge has been lost, I guess. So I don't know if I necessarily would see it as the start of a new period, but just sort of the closing down of that chapter is kind of sad, right? And then we're moving off in the direction of fewer and fewer of us producing food or procuring food, and also fewer and fewer landscapes probably capable of really supporting that many people as wildlands shrink. So I guess it just kind of makes me sad, and it kind of highlights some of these trends that we've been seeing of kind of as soon as agriculture started to appear, it kind of started to spread and get it adopted by different groups, and so it's kind of the culmination of that process that's maybe taken 10,000 years of human history. So
it's crazy. Yeah.
Who knows what's next?
Yeah. Well, geez, I hope it's not a food dystopia. I mean, I see these things about like 3D printed food, where your medical insurance company determines which print cartridges you're allowed to have based on your unique diet. And you're only allowed to print those foods. And those are made out of, 15 species or something. I mean, just like.
Right. Or Soylent.
Yeah.
Right. Are you familiar with that? There's like,
there's an actual product called that.
Yes.
Now, right?
Yes. That's what I was talking about. The actual product, the sort of like, bottled milkshake nutritional drink that's, I mean, I think that's the other thing that, you're a forager. I'm more interested in thinking about domesticates and farming, but I think one thing that they have in common is there's so much diversity of like cultigens, heirlooms, plants and animals out there, and it's not standardized, it's not processed, and I think it's really exciting to try. And so the idea of just my Soylent or just my pill or whatever for breakfast, lunch, and dinner seems like it's taken a lot away from what it means to be human.
Wow, your horticulture will be a revolutionary act of resistance in the future, I think. But
yeah, seriously.
Oh, that's wild. Robyn, it's been just a blast for me to talk to you. Your expertise is just incredible, and wow, it lights me up. Is there anything we didn't talk about today that you think is an important contribution in this conversation?
No, I think the real point that I wanted to make about farming and kind of just thinking about food in the past is the incredible amount of knowledge. I think that it's just really important for me that people think about folks in the past, ancient people, as just in terms of the knowledge that they had, their ingenuity, their ability to sort of practice observation and science and creativity, as opposed to kind of like the flat diorama, faceless, they just, made tools out of stone because they didn't know any better kind of view that we get. And it just is also as incredibly diverse experiences around the world interacting with different landscapes. So I guess that's just the takeaway vision that I have, and what makes me excited to talk about all of this stuff.
Yeah, it's like, if you think it's simple, try it.
Oh, seriously.
Go nap an arrowhead.
It's like go nap your arrowhead and then use it to kill something, and then figure out how to eat that safely, and then come back.
Bring a sperm whale back to shore for your people, and then we'll talk. Tell people where to get your book and anywhere else you want to point them to your work.
Yeah. So, you can look me up on the internet and find more about my teaching and research just by Googling my name. I'm at Center College. And then also you can find my book. It was published by the University of Alabama Press, so you can find it on their website, or of course, on your friendly local Amazon.
So friendly. So friendly.
So local.
Robyn, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. Help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 10 episodes. Season 2 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2022. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.